The rain hammered against the windows of Neverland Ranch like 1,000 desperate fists. Inside the sprawling estate, darkness had settled into every corner, thick and suffocating. It was 3 in the morning on November 12, 2003, and something terrible was unfolding behind those legendary gates. Michael Jackson, the king of pop, the man who had brought joy to billions, was fighting a battle that no one knew about. This wasn't a fight against tabloids or lawsuits. This was a fight for his very life. Sarah Martinez had been Michael's personal nurse for only 6 months, but in that short time, she had witnessed a slow unraveling of a broken man. Tonight, she stood outside his bedroom door, her hand trembling as she gripped her phone. The sounds coming from inside were barely human. Low moans mixed with shallow, gasping breaths. She had seen him deteriorating over the past weeks, watched as the pressures of fame, the crushing weight of accusations, and the physical pain from years of injuries pushed him toward a dangerous edge. Her training kicked in despite her fear. Sarah pushed open the heavy door and found Michael collapsed on the floor beside his bed. His skin was cold and clammy, his lips tinged with blue. Empty prescription bottles lay scattered across the carpet like fallen soldiers. The scene was devastating. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not to someone who had given so much to the world. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him, checking for a pulse. It was there, but weak, irregular, fighting. She called for help immediately, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. Within minutes, the estate security team arrived, followed by Dr. Alan Rothman, Michael's longtime physician who lived in a guest house on the property. The doctor took one look at the situation, and his face went pale. They were losing him. Every second counted now. Dr. Rothman began administering emergency treatment while Sarah documented everything, her hands shaking as she wrote. This moment would change everything. The ambulance couldn't come to Neverland. The press camped outside the gates would turn this into a circus, and Michael's condition was too fragile for that kind of exposure. They had to stabilize him here, in this room that had witnessed so much loneliness and pain. As Dr. Rothman worked, Sarah held Michael's hand, whispering words of encouragement. She told him about his children, about the fans who loved him, about all the music still left inside him. She refused to let him slip away into that dark silence. Hours passed like centuries. The storm outside grew more violent, as if nature itself was responding to the crisis unfolding within those walls. Lightning illuminated the room in brief, harsh flashes, revealing the desperate scene in stark detail. Michael's breathing remained shallow, but it was steady. He was fighting. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of hurt and medication and despair, the fighter who had survived a childhood in the spotlight, who had broken every record, who had changed music forever, was still there. By dawn, Michael's vital signs had improved enough for Dr. Rothman to step back and take a breath. Sarah remained at his bedside, exhausted but vigilant. The crisis had passed, but something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about saving a life tonight. This was about saving a soul that had been drowning for years. Sarah looked at the man sleeping fitfully on the bed and made a decision. She couldn't walk away. Not now. Michael Jackson needed more than medical care. He needed someone who would fight for him the way he had once fought for his dreams. As sunlight began to filter through the curtains, casting golden light across the room, Sarah understood the magnitude of what had almost been lost. The world knew Michael Jackson, the performer, the icon, the controversial figure. But she knew Michael, the human being, fragile and afraid, struggling with demons that fame and fortune couldn't defeat. Tonight had been a wake-up call, but it was also an opportunity to help him find his way back from the edge, to remember who he was before the world decided who he should be. The rescue had only just begun. 3 days after the crisis, Michael finally opened up to Sarah in a way he had never opened up to anyone. They sat in the library of Neverland, surrounded by thousands of books and the quiet ticking of an antique clock. Outside, the November sun struggled to break through gray clouds, casting the room in a dim, melancholy light. Michael looked smaller somehow, diminished, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm temperature. His eyes, once so bright and full of mischief, carried a weight that seemed impossible for one person to bear. He began to talk, and Sarah listened without judgment or interruption. He spoke about his childhood, about being thrust onto stages before he could fully understand what it meant, about his father's harsh discipline and impossible standards. He described the loss of innocence, not just his own, but the innocence he felt he could never give to others without suspicion and accusation. Every kind gesture had been twisted. Every moment of joy had been analyzed and weaponized against him. The world had taken his generosity and turned it into something dark. Michael's voice cracked as he talked about the isolation. Despite being surrounded by people constantly, he had never felt more alone. The crowd screamed his name, but did they see him? The media analyzed his every move, but did they understand him? His family loved him, but did they know him? The questions had plagued him for decades, eating away at his sense of self until he barely recognized his own reflection. The plastic surgeries, the skin treatments, the constant reinvention were all attempts to find someone he could live with, someone who could escape the prison of expectations. The physical pain was relentless too. Years of dancing, of pushing his body beyond human limits, had taken a terrible toll. His back hurt constantly from a stage accident during a concert years ago. His scalp still bore scars from when his hair caught fire during that Pepsi commercial shoot. Sleep had become impossible without medication, and the medication had become a trap of its own. He described waking up in the middle of the night, terrified and alone, reaching for pills that promised peace but delivered only temporary numbness. Sarah listened as Michael revealed the depth of his pharmaceutical dependence. It hadn't started as addiction. It had started as survival. Pain medication after the scalp burns. Sleeping pills for the insomnia that came with constant touring. Anxiety medication for the panic attacks that struck without warning. Over the years, the prescriptions had multiplied, and different doctors prescribed different things, none of them communicating with each other. Michael had become a walking pharmacy, and nobody had stopped to ask if this was healthy or sustainable. The allegations against him had been the final crushing blow. Michael's voice shook with genuine anguish as he insisted on his innocence, as he described how his love for children, rooted in his own stolen childhood, had been perverted and misunderstood. He had wanted to create safe spaces where kids could be kids, where they could play and laugh without the pressures he had faced. Instead, he had been painted as a monster. The accusations had shattered something fundamental inside him, had made him question whether kindness itself was dangerous, whether he should stop being who he was. Sarah saw clearly now what the world couldn't see. Michael Jackson wasn't a freak or a criminal or a has-been. He was a wounded soul who had given everything to his art and had been consumed by it. He was a man who had bought a ranch and filled it with rides and animals because he was desperately trying to create the childhood he never had. He was someone who had faced more scrutiny, more judgment, more hatred than most people could survive, and somehow he was still here, still breathing, still hoping that tomorrow might be better. As Michael finished speaking, tears streaming down his face, Sarah reached out and took his hand. She told him something that no one had told him in a long time. She told him that he deserved to heal, that he deserved to be happy, that his past didn't define his future. She promised him that she wouldn't abandon him like so many others had, that she would fight for his recovery as fiercely as he had fought for his music. In that moment, a bond formed between them, not of patient and nurse, but of two human beings acknowledging each other's pain and choosing to face it together. The path ahead would be brutal, but for the first time in years, Michael Jackson wasn't walking it alone. The intervention came 2 weeks later, and it was nothing like what anyone expected. Sarah had assembled a small team of people who genuinely cared about Michael, not his money or his fame, but his well-being. His sister Janet arrived first, her eyes red from crying even before she entered the room. She had watched her brother suffer from a distance, afraid to push too hard, afraid of pushing him away. Now she understood that silence had been its own form of abandonment. Michael's longtime friend Elizabeth Taylor joined them via video call from Los Angeles. Her health prevented her from traveling, but her presence was powerful nonetheless. She spoke to Michael with the fierce love of someone who understood the price of fame, who had lived through her own version of his hell. She told him that survival wasn't enough anymore. He deserved to thrive. Her words cut through his defenses in ways that clinical arguments never could. Dr. Rothman presented the medical reality with brutal honesty. Michael's body was shutting down. His liver was showing signs of damage from years of medication. His heart rhythm was irregular. His sleep patterns were so disrupted that he was essentially living in a constant state of exhaustion. Without immediate and drastic changes, he wouldn't live to see his children grow up. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and Michael finally broke. He sobbed openly, his whole body shaking with the weight of everything he had been carrying. The next morning, they began the detoxification process. Sarah had arranged for the ranch to become a temporary treatment facility with round-the-clock medical supervision and a team of specialists who signed strict confidentiality agreements. Michael couldn't go to a traditional rehab facility. The media would have destroyed him. His enemies would have used it as proof of their accusations. So they brought treatment to him, turning Neverland into a place of healing instead of hiding. The first 72 hours were absolutely brutal. Michael's body revolted against the absence of substances it had come to depend on. He sweated through sheets, vomited until there was nothing left, shook with tremors that scared even the medical staff. Sarah never left his side. She held cold compresses to his forehead, helped him to the bathroom when he was too weak to walk alone, and talked him through the worst moments when he begged for medication, when he screamed that he couldn't do this, that it was too hard, that dying would be easier. But something remarkable happened during those dark hours. Michael discovered reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. The same determination that had driven him to perfect the moonwalk, to create Thriller, to break down racial barriers in music, now fueled his fight for sobriety. He began to see the withdrawal as a performance of sorts, the most important performance of his life. Each hour he survived was a victory. Each day was a triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy him. Physical detox was only the beginning. The psychological work proved even more challenging. A therapist named Dr. Chen began daily sessions with Michael, carefully unpacking decades of trauma. They addressed the abuse from his childhood, the loss of autonomy, the constant invasion of privacy, the betrayal by people he had trusted. Michael had never properly grieved for the childhood he lost, for the normal life that was stolen from him at age 5. Now, at 4 to 5, he finally mourned. The therapy sessions revealed patterns that Michael had never recognized. He saw how he had sought approval from the world to replace the approval he never got from his father. He understood how his need to be loved had made him vulnerable to manipulation. He recognized that his desire to help children stemmed from a beautiful impulse, but that he had not protected himself adequately, had not understood how his innocence would be perceived by a cynical world. The realizations were painful, but they were also liberating. Janet visited every other day, and gradually other family members came too. Conversations that should have happened years ago finally took place. Forgiveness was offered and received. Michael apologized for pushing people away, for disappearing into his own world of pain. They apologized for not fighting harder to reach him, for not recognizing how desperately he needed help. The Jackson family, so famous for their talent and success, finally began to heal the wounds that fame had created. By the end of the first month, Michael had crossed the threshold. He was physically clean for the first time in over a decade. His eyes were clearer, his skin healthier, his mind sharper. But more importantly, he had started to rediscover who Michael Jackson was beneath the King of Pop. He began taking walks around Neverland, really seeing the place he had created. He spent time with his children without the fog of medication clouding every moment. He even started playing piano again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The music was still there, waiting for him to return. 2 months into his recovery, Michael made a decision that terrified everyone around him. He wanted to face his accusers, not in court, but in his own mind and heart. He needed to process the trauma of the allegations, to understand how he had reached this point, to make peace with the reality that some people would always believe the worst about him. Dr. Chen warned that this could be dangerous, that confronting such painful material could trigger a relapse. But Michael was insistent. He couldn't move forward if he kept running from past. They began what Dr. Chen called exposure therapy, carefully revisiting the events that had broken Michael's spirit. They talked about the 1993 allegations, about the strip search that had humiliated him, about the settlement that many people interpreted as an admission of guilt. Michael described the feeling of being violated by the very systems meant to protect the innocent, of being presumed guilty by public opinion before any trial took place. He wept as he remembered standing in that room, being photographed like a criminal, knowing that his body was being documented as evidence in a case built on lies. The current charges hanging over him were even more devastating because they represented a pattern, a narrative that the media had eagerly embraced. Michael talked about the boy at the center of the allegations, a child he had tried to help, whose family he had welcomed into his home and life. He described the betrayal he felt when kindness was repaid with accusations, when generosity was twisted into malice. Sarah watched as Michael grappled with a terrible realization. No amount of good intentions could protect him from people who saw him only as a target, a meal ticket, a headline. But Dr. Chen pushed Michael to go deeper, to examine his own choices and blind spots. Why had he continued to invite children to Neverland even after the 1993 allegations? Why had he been so naive about how his behavior would be perceived? Michael struggled with these questions because they forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. He had been so desperate for innocence and purity in his life that he had stopped seeing danger. He had believed that his genuine love for children would be obvious to everyone. He had not understood that his fame made him a permanent suspect, that his eccentricity made him an easy target. The most painful session came when they discussed his relationship with his own children. Prince, Paris, and Blanket were the lights of his life, but Michael realized that his addiction and depression had stolen precious time with him. They had seen him at his worst, had witnessed their father suffering, had felt the fear when he was so sick. Michael broke down completely, overcome with guilt and shame. He had wanted to give them everything, but what they needed most was a healthy, present father. His children deserved better than what he had been giving them. Sarah suggested that Michael write letters to his children, letters they wouldn't read until they were older, explaining everything. Michael embraced this idea with an intensity that surprised everyone. Night after night, he sat at his desk, pouring his heart onto paper. He wrote about his mistakes and his love, his regrets and his hopes. He apologized for the chaos of their lives and promised to do better. He told them about the music inside him, about the dreams he still had, about the man he was trying to become. The letters became a form of redemption, a way of making sense of his journey. As winter turned to spring, Michael started engaging with the world again, but differently this time. He began reading news articles about himself with Dr. Chen's guidance, learning to separate truth from fiction, learning to accept that he couldn't control public perception. This was incredibly difficult for someone who had spent his entire life crafting his image, who had turned himself into a brand, who had tried to be perfect for everyone. Letting go of that need for universal approval felt like stepping off a cliff, but it was also strangely freeing. Michael started writing music again, but not for an album or for the public. He wrote for himself, pouring his experience into lyrics and melodies that nobody would ever hear. These songs were raw and honest, filled with pain and hope in equal measure. He wrote about addiction and recovery, about betrayal and forgiveness, about falling apart and putting the pieces back together. The music was his therapy, his voice when spoken words weren't enough. Sarah would sometimes hear him late at night, playing piano and singing softly, and she knew he was healing. The legal case continued to loom over everything, but Michael was facing it with new clarity. His lawyers were preparing for trial, and Michael was preparing himself emotionally. He understood now that the outcome, whatever it might be, didn't define his worth as a human being. He was learning to separate Michael Jackson the person from Michael Jackson the symbol. One was vulnerable and flawed and trying. The other was an invention, a reflection of the world's desires and fears. He needed to protect the person, even if the symbol was destroyed. One afternoon, Michael called Sarah into the library. He looked healthier than she had ever seen him, his eyes bright and focused. He told her something that made her heart swell with pride. He said that for the first time in decades, he actually wanted to live. Not just survive, not just exist, but truly live. He wanted to see his children grow up. He wanted to create new music. He wanted to prove that recovery was possible, that people could change, that even the most broken souls could find their way back to wholeness. The rescue that had begun that rainy November night had transformed into something beautiful, a rebirth. The trial began in early 2005, and it was every bit as devastating as Michael had feared. Every day, he dressed in his finest clothes and walked into that courthouse, facing cameras and protesters in a media circus that turned justice into entertainment. But something was different now. Michael wasn't just the accused anymore. He was a man fighting for his life in every sense, and that fight had made him stronger. Sarah accompanied him every day, a steady presence in the chaos, reminding him of how far he had come. The testimony was brutal. The prosecution painted Michael as a predator, twisting his kindness into calculation, his eccentricity into evidence of guilt. They paraded witnesses who described Neverland as a trap, who claimed that Michael's generosity had ulterior motives. Michael sat through it all, his jaw clenched, his hands folded in his lap. There were moments when Sarah could see him struggling, when the old panic threatened to surface, when the urge to escape into medication must have been overwhelming. But Michael breathed through it, using the techniques Dr. Chen had taught him, holding onto his sobriety like a lifeline. The defense told a different story, one of a man who had been targeted repeatedly because of his wealth and fame, a man whose genuine love for children had been weaponized against him. They brought witnesses who testified to Michael's character, to his generosity, to his innocence. Janet took the stand, her voice shaking with emotion as she defended her brother. Other celebrities spoke on his behalf. The jury heard about the 1993 settlement, about how Michael had been advised to pay rather than endure a lengthy trial, how that decision had haunted him ever since. Throughout the trial, Michael maintained his sobriety, and this was perhaps his greatest victory. There were nights when the stress was unbearable, when the temptation to numb the pain was almost irresistible. But Michael had something now that he hadn't had before, a support system that actually worked. Sarah, Dr. Chen, Janet, and a small circle of trusted friends formed a wall around him, protecting him from his own worst impulses. They celebrated each sober day like the miracle it was. The verdict came in June 2005, after months of testimony and deliberation. Michael was acquitted on all counts. The courtroom erupted, and Michael collapsed into his lawyer's arms, overwhelmed with relief and exhaustion. He had been vindicated by the justice system, but more importantly, he had vindicated himself. He had faced the worst accusations imaginable and had come through it without destroying himself in the process. That night, back at Neverland, surrounded by his children and closest friends, Michael allowed himself to feel joy for the first time in years. But the acquittal wasn't the end of the story. Michael understood that his life couldn't return to what it was before. Neverland, once his sanctuary, now felt tainted by the trial and the accusations. The media would never stop scrutinizing him. The public would never fully let go of their suspicions. So Michael made another brave decision. He would leave Neverland, leave America, and start over somewhere he could heal completely. It was heartbreaking to say goodbye to the place he had built with so much hope, but staying felt like living in a museum of his own trauma. Michael moved to Bahrain, then Ireland, seeking peace and anonymity that proved elusive. But he didn't move alone. Sarah had made a commitment to see him through his recovery, and she kept that promise. She helped him establish new routines in new places, helped him navigate the challenges of life without the familiar structures of Neverland. Michael's children adjusted to their new lives, and slowly they began to see a different version of their father. He was present now, engaged, playful in ways he hadn't been when medication clouded every interaction. The music started flowing again, but differently. Michael wasn't chasing hits or trying to top Thriller. He was creating from a place of authenticity, writing songs that reflected his journey through darkness and back into light. Some of these songs would never be released, but they didn't need to be. They served their purpose by existing, by giving Michael a way to process and express everything he had experienced. His voice, that extraordinary instrument, carried new depth and weight, seasoned by suffering and redemption. By 2007, Michael had been sober for over 3 years. This anniversary was celebrated privately, in a small gathering of the people who had fought alongside him. Sarah looked at the man before her and could barely recognize the broken figure she had found on that bedroom floor years ago. Michael was healthy, clear-eyed, purposeful. He'd talk about plans for the future, about eventually performing again, about creating new art, about being the father his children deserved. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. There were setbacks, of course. Recovery isn't linear, and Michael had moments of weakness, days when the depression crept back, times when the physical pain made him crave the relief of medication. But he had learned to reach out instead of retreating. He called Sarah or Dr. Chen. He talked to Janet. He used the tools he had been given. And each time he chose health over habit, the choice became a little bit easier. He was rewiring decades of patterns, and that work would never be completely finished. Michael began working with organizations that helped other people struggling with addiction, sharing his story anonymously at first, then more openly. He wanted to use his experience to help others, to turn his pain into something meaningful. He spoke about the unique pressures of fame and how they contributed to substance abuse. He talked about the importance of mental health care, about breaking the stigma, about asking for help before it was too late. His advocacy gave him purpose beyond performance, beyond being the king of pop. In the final months of his recovery journey documented here, Michael returned to the stage for a private performance at a charity event. It was small and intimate, nothing like the massive productions of his prime. But as he sang, Sarah watched from the wings and saw something beautiful. Michael was fully present in that moment, not performing a role but being himself, sharing his gift without the burden of trying to be perfect. The audience saw it too, and the connection was electric. This was what recovery looked like, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose. The rescue that began on that rainy night in November 2003 had come full circle. Michael Jackson, the man who had almost been lost to addiction and despair, had saved himself with the help of people who refused to give up on him. He had faced his demons, confronted his trauma, and emerged transformed. The world would always remember him as a king of pop, but Sarah would remember him as something more profound. A survivor, a fighter, a human being who proved that it's never too late to change, to heal, to rise from the ashes. Michael Jackson's greatest performance wasn't on any stage. It was a daily performance of choosing life, choosing health, choosing hope. And that performance would continue, one day at a time, for as long as he drew breath. The rescue was complete, but the journey of healing would last forever.